Hi everyone, this is Eric from Dumb Game Dev, and today we're going to be looking at moving a third-person controller with the Vive trackpads. So using our thumbs to move objects around. Now in this case, I'm just going to be moving around this cube on the scene, and let's get started. So I've created a cube. This is just my test scene. There's nothing particular about it, and it's just a plain cube. We just went and said create 3D object cube, and I added a sphere on either side just so we can keep track of the direction. So if we take a look here on my hierarchy, we can see there's a sphere childed to this 3D cube, and I added a color to it just to make it easier to see and pay attention to. Now the next thing you're going to need right away, and you might as well start off the bat, is you need a character controller on this for this method of moving around our actor. And it will actually get automatically added when we do it, but let's just add it now. So you're just going to go add component and then just choose character controller. Okay. And then you'll end up with this. You might need to adjust the step offset if you're seeing some errors. I needed to make my step offset much smaller because I have a small cube. And your console will throw up some errors if that's happening. Now the next thing you want to do is make sure that you have your box collider off. I found that if you have extra colliders on, they can potentially cause some problems, so you can experiment with that. And lastly, you need to make sure you don't have any rigid body going on. So if you have a rigid body and a character controller, some weird things can happen. You can test it out and see how that works for you, but for me, I have some specific problems with that. Now, when you are using a character controller, you do need to bake the nav mesh system that's built into Unity to get it to move around. Otherwise, again, you're going to throw up a bunch of errors while this is happening. So just to do that, you're just going to choose Window and choose Navigation, and I have mine docked up here in the corner. And I'm not going to really go into how to bake nav meshes and stuff like that. I mean, there's lots of tutorials about this, but basically just choose Bake and then hit the Bake button, and it's going to take care of everything on its own. Now these blue areas are the areas where my cube will be able to move. As you can see, close to certain parts of the wall and stuff, it won't bang into those. So that's it. So let's take a look at the Playmaker side of things, and then we can look at some of the VRTK Playmaker actions that we have to make this happen. Now to do this, you have to have the VRTK action set installed, and you can get that from the GitHub account. It will be in the description. And it's going to give you some extra VRTK actions. So we have the standard VRTK actions here, which is already getting pretty long. I might have to separate those out. And then we have the VRTK controller events. And so these are all just the controller. And this is what we're going to be using today because we want to get the touchpad information. Now, specifically what we want from the touchpad is we want the, let's see here, the get the touchpad access, which gives us an XY Vector2, and we also want the get touchpad pressed. So this is when the touchpad is pushed and held down. So this will help us to start and stop our cube, and I'll show you how that works. Now I already have the FSM set up, but I'm going to make another one. I just like to keep my old FSM here for reference in case I forgot what I did the first time, because that does happen sometimes, so that would be embarrassing. So I'm going to make a new FSM. I can just go say add component and then just type Playmaker, or maybe just type FSM. There we go. And we've got a new FSM. I'm going to name it tutorial third person mover. And then I'll give a little description so I know what it does, and I'm just going to write this moves the cube, right? Okay, so I've got my FSM actually right on the right controller, and this is using the VRTK setup. So if you don't have VRTK set up, go to the VRTK tutorials and watch how to set up your controllers and a play area. So, but you want the FSM right on the VRTK right controller or left controller, not on the camera rig's right or left controller for the SteamVR. And as you can see, I already have some scripts here. You can safely ignore most of these, but the ones that you definitely need is you need this VRTK controller event script to be on your right and left controller in order to use this Playmaker action. This Playmaker action relies on the script to get the information about where you're pressing on the controller. So just make sure you have VRTK controller event script, and you could just choose add component, type it in, and we'll add it. But I'm going to close these up because we're not going to use them again. That's it. So we're just going to focus on this tutorial third-person mover. And we can choose it from our list here. It's blank. And it comes off with a start and a state 1. So the state 1 is we want to set up what we're going to call a listener. And let's just say it's waiting for controller events to happen, right? And then once some kind of controller event happens, we want it to move to the next state. So we'll just say finished, and then goes to the next state. And the next state we're going to have something like move cube, right? So really, we just need 2 states to make this happen. So what we want to listen for is the trackpad to be pressed, because until that happens, we don't need anything to actually happen. So let's just choose actions, and on VRT controller, we look for the get touchpad pressed. And if we hover our mouse over here, the touchpad press, it gives us a little description. This will be true if the touchpad is held down. So let's see here. So the game object that we're using is the owner. The owner here is the right controller, and it already has the script on it that we need, which is the controller events script. You could make this FSM somewhere else, but then you need to choose a specific game object and then drag the right controller over here. But we're using the owner. So we need to check for this every frame. We don't need it to fire off just once. If it fires off just once when we start, we're definitely going to miss it. So for this to move into the next state, we need it to trigger some kind of an event. We need it to not only check the trackpad, but or touchpad, we need it to do something. So the next action we're going to have is we need a bool changed, because it's stored in a bool. So we'll say bool changed, and we'll move that down to the bottom because these happen in order. It goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? So we need it to check which variable. Well, this is not being stored in a variable yet, so I actually went ahead and created a variable beforehand, and okay, I don't see a variable, so that's okay. Let's make a new variable. We're going to call this touchpad, is pressed. So give us something descriptive. So it's currently false, of course, we're not pushing the touchpad. So which bool are we going to check? We are going to put this in here. So now touchpad is pressed. It's going to check that and the change event. So if this changes, it's going to fire a finished event. So the finish will just fire over here. Let's make a new event. We'll just call this has changed, right? We'll remove this one here and add our transition, has changed, and it will go over here. Okay, we just had a little break there. My dog's going crazy. So where were we at here? The listener, the bool has changed, and we've gone into the next state. So the next state's move cube. So we'll give a description. This little cube is now moving. And so for the cube to move, we need to get the axis, which is XY, Vector2 of the touchpad. So we'll go touchpad, search here, and we get the touchpad axis. And we've added. So the touchpad axis coming from the owner, game object use owner. Again, if we didn't have it on the right controller, left controller, we need to specify the game object. So because we do have this on the right controller, it's just going to work for the right controller. Now the touchpad axis we want to store in a variable. As you can see, again, it's 0, 0 because it's not being pressed. So we need to set up a new variable for this, and it's going to be a vector2 variable, and we'll call this touchpad axis. Maybe I'll call it vector2, just so I know it's a vector2. And again, we're going to need this in every frame. As we move into this state, we need to constantly be tracking this touchpad. Now the magic happens to move this little boop bop box here is, let's have a look here, we need some kind of controller mover. Okay, and we need some kind of character controller for this, and the one we're going to use here is under characters, and we're going to use the controller move event, or action, sorry. And we'll double click to add that and add it to the bottom. We need to first get the touchpad access, then the controller will move. And we need to set the game object. And as you can see in the description, actually you can't see my faces over it, but in the description it says moves game object with the character controller. So we've already added the character controller. And we don't want to move the owner. The owner is our handset, so we want to specify a game object. And the game object we're going to use is our little boop bop box here. And the vector we're going to use, as you can see, there is no vector options available for us. And the reason is if we unclick this, it's looking for a Vector3. And currently we just have a Vector2. So we need to rectify that by changing our Vector2 into a Vector3. And we can do that first by getting this Vector2 and putting them into their own variables. So let's just see get Vector2 XY. So that looks good. Throw that in there. And we're going to want this right below the touchpad axis. And again, we're going to use the owner. Let's move this up. Controller, there we go. Controller mover, controller move. Uh-oh, I got this in here twice. That's confusing me. Okay. Okay, so we got touchpad access, get vector2, controller move. Okay, so get vector2, the variable we want is the touchpad axis vector we set up, and we're going to store the x. I'm just going to call it vector x, and then we got a vector y. Okay, so we have x and y, and it still needs a vector3, and see it cannot take them one by one, so we need to say set a vector3, set vector3 x, y, z. So we're going to have this below the get vector2, otherwise we won't have any information yet. And we got to set up a new variable for that. We're going to call this touchpad access vector3. And for the values, let's see here. Okay, so I already know this. You may not have guessed it, but the x value needs the x. And actually for the y value, we're going to leave this as 0. If you see the y value on the screen here, and you look up, y is up and down, so we don't need up and down, we need like left and right. So we're going to set our z to our y. So X to X and Y to Z. Okay, so that would pretty much do us, except for the fact that once we get into the state, we are not getting out of this state. So what would happen is if we pushed our thumb pad and we started to move this, it would sort of move indefinitely because it would not get out of the state. Oh, we forgot to put in our controller vectors here. Let's throw this in. So the move vector, we just want the touchpad 3. There we go. So yeah, we need to be able to get out of this state. So what we're going to need to do is see if the touchpad is still being pressed. And if it's not being pressed, then we need to go back to the listener to wait for it to be pressed. If it's still being pressed, we want to stay here, right? So let's just go back to touchpad. So touchpad being pressed. Yeah, we want that at the bottom because we want this to check at the very end. So move action to bottom. And we're still using the owner, and the touchpad being pressed. Can use this variable again. Can update it. And then we need to see if it's changed, right? So we're gonna need another kind of bool test. We want not a bool changed, actually. What I'm looking for is a bool test. This one will do it for me. Put this at the end. So the bool variable we're checking is that the touchpad is being pressed. So if it's true, still true, we want it to do nothing. We just want it to stay here. If it's false, we want to say this state has finished. And we'll have the finished go back and start re-listening for it being pressed down. So we just go back and forth between these states. Now we are missing one more thing to make this work. We need this to be happening again and again and again and again and again, right? We can't just have it fire off once and then it would move like a bleep and then it would stop, if that even. So we need to make sure we have every frame checked off. So we need this every frame. We need this to check every frame, every frame, every frame, every frame, every frame. Okay, so just a quick review. We get the touchpad access from the Vive controller. We stored in a Vector2. So we need to get the XY out of that Vector2. So we store those in a Vector X variable and a Vector Y. We need to put those into a Vector3, an XYZ, so we put those in. Remember, we set the Y to 0 because we don't want it to move up and down. Then we use a controller move to move our boop bop here. And the directions we're going to use is just the vector directions, the Vector3 we set up. Then lastly, we need to check if the touchpad is still being pressed. And if it is still being pressed, this is going to go down to the bottom and then go back up to the top and restart and just keep going through. Okay, and if it's changed, it's no longer true, it's become false, then it's going to finish and go back and wait. So I'm just going to save this and let's give it a try and see what happens. Great, as we can see, it moves around just using the thumb pad, but as you probably notice, it doesn't face any specific direction. It always keeps the same direction based on this. So that could be good in certain situations, but maybe we want it to face where we're pointing, especially if we weren't using a cube, but say we were using an animated character of some type, like a humanoid character using Mechanim. It would always be facing the wrong way, right? It would always be facing one direction. So if we were using something like Mechanim to animate a character, we need it to face the direction that it's moving. And luckily, this is not too difficult in Playmaker to set up. What we need it to do is, we want it to, let's say, look and it's in the transforms here. And I'm going to choose a smooth look at, let's see. Yeah, I'm going to use a smooth look at direction. So let's pop this in here. And we're going to move this down towards the end, but before the bool test and before the get touchpad press. So controller move, yes, then the smooth look at direction. So we're going to keep using the owner, but the target direction is going to be our touchpad access vector3. We can just use the same vector3. Now the minimum magnitude will be, well, I'll let you read over these. It's not really important for what we're doing at the moment. I'm just going to leave the speed as 5. It's going to keep it vertical. We don't have an up and down anyway, so it's just going to keep, if we were using a true vector3 from things shaking or rotating, but we're not actually, so that doesn't matter. And lastly, we don't need any finish event because we don't want this to finish when it's looked at something. We want it to keep going. So let's give this a try and see how it works. Right, so that didn't work the way I was hoping, and the reason is, let's look here. The smooth look at direction shouldn't be using the owner, it should be using a game object, and it should be using boop bop in there. So let's try that one more time and see if that helps. Perfect, so that works exactly as I hoped. I can use one thumb on the Vive controller to move my character controller around. Now, I mean, the good and the bad of this is that it's not, it's easy to set up and it's quite smooth, but it's not a physics-based movement because it's using the character controller. Another thing is the speed is not variable. There is some different ways to set it up. Probably the easiest way to set up the speed for now, just if you want it more simple to be faster or slower, we could set up a probably a magnitude or a multiplier. So there's a Vector3 multiplier. And let's see here. We can move this farther up. We put it right after our Vector3. And we put in our Vector3 variable. And we could add a multiplier. So if we did this by 2 or by 3, it would move quite fast. If we did this as like a 0.5, we could move things much slower. And so you could set up the speed based on this. That's one way to set up the speed. Okay, so another little trick I've done is if you want to set it up more like a turret, for example. I'm going to remove this multiplier. What we could do is put this onto 2 controllers, and I've already actually gone ahead and done that. And I would just copy and paste this over, so we'll just grab this, copy this component, and go over to the left controller. And let's paste this as a new component here on the left controller. And so now our right and left have the same movers. So on the right side, we're going to do everything the same, except for we're not going to look at the direction. We're going to disable this so it won't look at the direction anymore. We'll go over to the left controller, and we can disable the move, but we still have the look at. Now, this doesn't work perfectly in the sense that pushing forward will always go forward in the direction that you're looking. It doesn't quite work that way. We'd have to do some more modifications. It works more like a turret where one controller moves every direction and the other one looks around. And I'll give you a demonstration, but you might have to try this yourself to get a feeling of how it works. So let's just make sure we have these disabled. Okay, we just want to be using the tutorial ones that we set up. We don't want to be shooting off any other FSMs. Okay, let's give it a play and right, so that's not too bad. We could use that to maybe like mount a gun on it and move it somewhere and then spin it around and shoot something. As you saw, I still had actually my straight pointer renderer, my laser from the VRTK on, so I'd have to disable that if I'm going to use my two thumb pads in this way. So this is the first way to use this third-person controller and to move things around. This should get you started. I'm going to make a second short tutorial on this, building off of this, about using force and using the physics version of this. And it's a little bit different, but it also has some similar things. So you can go over to the next tutorial to watch that one.